Book 5, Salem, Safety Assured, Leaving East of Medicetti, Chapter 33. You see what you want to see, Perrin. Mari was at the Zenas's when Shem rode up to the house that evening. Calla burst into a grin, and Mari patted her on the back. I'll finish up dinner. You go greet your husband. Mari giggled when she heard Shem burst into the side door. What he did with his wife, Mari didn't know, but she heard Calla announce loudly, "And Mari came over to help me make dinner. She's in the kitchen right now." "But I'll be leaving," Mari called out, "as soon as I get this bread out of the oven and hear an update on my husband." Shem came into the kitchen with a self-conscious smile on his face. "Thanks, Mari. I appreciate you, making dinner or leaving you two alone. And Lilla's over at my house putting something together for Pato. We're a little scrambled up around here. I'm sure it won't take much to persuade Lilla to stay at our place for a while so you two can have your privacy." Shem was purple with embarrassment as Calla put her arms around him. You don't, that's not..." Mari chuckled as she took the bread out of the oven. "I really need to leave you two alone. So, Shem, you still think there's not much progress?" Shem shrugged. "And I seem to be the only one. John is fascinated and willing, and as I suspected he would be, but so is Raiden. Personally, I think he's playing them all, and that he's just gathering information to share with someone else later." Mari wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, Perrin knows soldiers are duplicitous like that. He'll see through it." "But he's not. Mari, he's buying Raiden's little act. And he's got the scouts convinced that Raiden's sincere. We spy on them and listen in, and every time I think Raiden's pulling a fast one, Perrin's convinced he's genuine." "Oh dear," Mari sighed. "I'm really not sure what to think. Perrin's usually not gullible. Are you sure Raiden's not coming around?" She didn't expect to see the antagonism rise in his eyes so quickly. You two, don't see it." "I don't see anything, Shem," she reminded him. "I'm miles away. I'm merely trying to put together a puzzle for which I don't get to see most of the pieces. All I'm saying is Perrin's a very good judge of character. Usually. Perhaps you are too skeptical," he snapped. Calla recoiled at his anger, but Mari smiled sadly. "Apparently you've been accused of that before, and quite recently. I'm sorry. I don't mean to doubt you or my husband. Right now, I'm not on either of your sides. You have a difficult situation, no doubt, and I think you need to put all of that aside," she said, "and now sit down to dinner with your dear, sweet wife, and have a quiet evening with only her. The calming benefits of marriage and all of that," she added as Shem blushed. "Tell my husband tomorrow morning that his interns were most upset to hear he won't be back for a while, and that I keep myself quite occupied and that I don't miss him one bit. That's the best I can do for you, Shem. And now I will leave you two alone." "Oh, I forgot about my interns." Perrin rubbed his chin the next morning. "And the hundreds of volunteers coming to help clear out brush. Well, I guess we'll just push those plans back a few weeks. And Mari's really all right with this? Keeping herself occupied?" he asked Shem. "Well, good," he decided. "It's about time she's realized there's more to life than just adoring me." Shem scoffed a laugh. "You keep telling yourself that." "You seem to be in a better mood," Perrin hinted. Shem ignored that and took his pack off his horse. "What's the plan today for Afra and Raiden?" "Understood," Perrin chuckled quietly. "Been enjoying the calming benefits of marriage, I see." More loudly, he said, "Winter's teaching them a modified first lesson, like the scouts do in the world, all about Queruls and the Great War." "And how's it going?" Shem asked as they walked into the stables to take care of his horse. "Wait, let me guess. Both John and Raiden are just so enthusiastic about it." "Of course they are," Perrin said. a little surprised by Shem's sarcasm. Perrin, Shem sighed dramatically as he undid his horse's saddle. You've gone as rusty as those iron balls we buried. Raiden's playing all of you. He's mimicking John's behavior so that we'll keep revealing more information. Once he has enough, and he's got too much already, he will make a run for it. That's not it at all, Perrin insisted. He's learning everything he needs to bring back to the world the most compelling report that will get him promoted and placed somewhere more interesting than Scrub. Just think of what Cayan Thorne and Nico Mal will do with that information. Shem put a hand on his waist and beckoned to Perrin with the other. Come on, give it to me. The great comeback. Perrin folded his arms and leaned against a wall. You haven't been here since yesterday afternoon. A lot can change in an evening. Raiden really is trying to accept it all. I spied on him when he was talking to the other scouts. You see what you want to see, Perrin. That's a worldly problem that you haven't yet left behind. When we look hard enough for what we want to see, we will see it every time. You find that evidence even if it doesn't exist. That argument could be made about anything, Perrin insisted. You could say that about the Creator or visions of the Guide. That's right, Shem nodded. Absolutely. I could be just as deceived by my own hopes and beliefs as anyone in the world. And to the world, I'm sure I appear deluded. But I derive great comfort from my delusions, so why would I want to believe anything else? So you think I'm delusional? Perrin squinted. Shem sighed. I think all of us are delusional, some more than others, but I do think you're seeing what you hope is there. You want this for Raiden because it's giving you so much joy. But the nature of your heart is very different than Raiden's. He may not be ready for this for many years. You can't change a heart. Only the owner of it can choose to have it changed, and even then he has to let the Creator in to finish the job. Perrin rubbed his forehead. I'm going to prove you wrong, Shem. I sincerely hope so, Perrin. A week they'd been there. Raiden had been counting down not only the days, but the hours and minutes. A week! Reading histories and talking about the Creator, who these garters believe was a real immortal being, not some grand manipulator who tried to control the world in the very early days. Reading the writings which maintained that miracles still occurred. Raiden was going to need one fast. Captain Thorne would expect them back next week, but as agreeable as Raiden had been, as open as he tried to appear, there was no evidence of the scouts letting him or Afra go anytime soon. No, apparently they had at least another 2 weeks of training, which would put them long past the time Thorne expected them to return. But tomorrow they'd be meeting the mysterious men in charge. Raiden had the nagging feeling that those men would decide his fate, and that being allowed to go back to the world would not be one of those choices. Not that their confinement hadn't been pleasant, he reflected reluctantly, as he lay in his sleeping net and stared into the dark. Along with studying, they'd taken many walks around the small valley, learning about different shrubbery, terrain, what a glacier was, and why it left the pristine body of water no one ever touched, and all kinds of scientific facts that no one in the world knew. And Raiden remembered it all. Already Winter provided so much information that Raiden was sure he'd be appointed colonel when he presented it all, along with his meticulously recorded notes, to Snide. And he needed those notes, because stories and histories of what he knew, and what he was now learning, were swirling in his mind and crashing into each other, creating a chaos of thoughts. But he could understand why Terryp and his stories were silenced by the Queruls, and the administrators as well. You can't have bits of information floating around that run contrary to the current political river. It would create a flooding mess. Keeping the world flowing properly was the purpose of government, not trying to discover new things that confused everyone about what they already knew. So much knowledge needed to be regulated, or the entire harmony of the world could be in jeopardy. And it was that so-called knowledge that Raiden held suspect. Yes, they read fragile parchments from hundreds of years ago that claimed to hold the truth, but did they? Couldn't the ancient writers have been just as manipulative as the current ones? How could anyone be sure of any truth? They couldn't. That was obvious. Even Winter admitted it when Raiden offhandedly brought up the subject. Naturally, he had a ready answer. Believe what rings true to you. Open your mind to let out all the preconceived notions, then let the new ones rattle around in there. Consider the possibilities and what they could mean, and why others chose to suppress them. Honestly analyze everything before accepting it or dismissing it. It was a long answer, too. Raiden lost interest halfway through Winter's earnest rambling, but John licked it all up. Raiden even caught Afra heading to the stables last evening, after receiving permission from Winter. When Raiden asked why he went, John blushed and said that he was going to pray, to sort out what he was feeling. When he came back more than an hour later, he was smiling, but his eyes were red and puffy. He said he'd had a wonderful talk, and was even more excited about joining these men committed to nothing. He felt it was right. That's when Raiden knew his companion was too far gone. Feelings were never to be trusted because they were too easily imagined and twisted. He'd learned that much from Lemuel Thorne. All you could do was rely upon facts, which, now that he thought about it, were often based on what someone felt was proven true. Raiden rubbed his eyes. He knew he was too exhausted, because some of the things they'd been telling him actually made sense. And that was the trouble. When truth is mixed in with lies, how do you pick out what's real? It was like trying to separate water from mud, a spoonful at a time. The problem, he realized, was that he liked his life as it had been for the past 25 years. It was orderly, because others had decided long ago what was worth knowing. The sky was blue, and everyone knew what was real. Why mess it all up because someone claims it's not the truth? Besides, position and power awaited him in the world. What could these men offer him? Jerky and wildflowers? Raiden rolled over in his net, trying to get comfortable. He'd start looking for a way out before he learned anything else that could mess up the tidiness of his brain. There was only so much truth a man should have to take. "Are you absolutely sure about doing this tomorrow?" Shem asked Perrin one more time as Shem readied his horse to head back to Salem for the night. "Did you see his face this evening?" Perrin said. "The boy was positively beaming." "It's not John I'm worried about," Shem grumbled. "And I still don't think it's a good idea you two having your secret little meetings here. It makes John all too cheerful, and Raiden will get suspicious." Perrin waved that off. Raiden doesn't care. John tells him he's going to the stables to pray and meditate, and Raiden has no desire to follow. "And isn't that telling?" Shem probed. "He's not at the same level of readiness, Perrin." "Tomorrow we'll get him there," Perrin assured him. "When he meets us again and Guide Glees, faced with all of that evidence, he will have no choice but to accept what we can offer him." Shem groaned. "I cannot have this argument with you again. I just can't." "So don't. Go home to your wife," Perrin said, a little testily. "Complain to my wife, grouse together for a while, then come back in a good mood because tomorrow everything changes." Shem swung up onto his horse. "If Raiden's heart is still solidly in the world, no amount of evidence will change that." "Yes, it will," Perrin insisted. "If his heart is still in the world, I'll just pull it out." "That is not the best metaphor, Perrin." The next day at midday meal, Raiden felt increasingly edgy. This afternoon they were to meet the men in charge. He had a suspicion that at least one of them was already there, that either he or another left each evening and returned each morning. They were never allowed to go to the stables without permission, and at certain times of the day he could hear a horse leave. He and Afra would be funneled back into the fort if they were outside and not allowed to see out the windows which way the rider went. But in such a narrow valley, the echoes of the horse made it clear the rider went to and returned from the north. That's where they were in some fashion. Apparently, another one of the men in charge was coming from a far distance just to meet them. And then, Raiden was sure, the evaluation would begin, and his life sentence to that tiny valley would commence. He had to escape. Today, somehow. He hoped that Edge wasn't as far away as he feared. Yet the other place, whose name they still didn't share, also couldn't have been too far away because riders went out at night and returned in the morning. The most logical direction for Edge was then in the south. But logical also meant woefully obvious, so Edge couldn't be that way. No, Edge had to lie in another direction. The scouts were too careful with what they said and how they acted. When they left in the mornings to secure the area, they went in every direction. While two always went south, others went to the east, to the west, and even north. But which way should he go? One nagging thought kept returning to Raiden. While he had hoped Edge was nearby, he had to admit the possibility that he could have been sedated for days and dragged over all kinds of terrain before reaching that bizarre little fort. That would also mean that Thorn might already be missing him. He may have sent new searchers by now, and by some stroke of ridiculously good luck, they'd seen this fort already and had gone back to tell Thorn before Raiden could get any credit. Panic rose in his throat like a bad sausage. It had to happen today, Raiden knew. The question was, how? And the obvious next question was, when? Interrupting his anxious rumination was one of the guards, coming into the eating area. The men in charge would like to meet you in the meadows on the other side of the western ridge. Winter blinked at him. Why? Because, the guard said, there's proof over there about what you've been teaching our two lieutenants. Internally, Raiden bristled at our, but he just plastered on a smile as eager as John's. Oh, what is it, sirs? John was practically bouncing in his seat. The guard grinned. Elk. The lieutenants frowned. What in the world was elk? But Winter chuckled. The western herds returned? Rather poor timing, though, the guard said. The cattle are on their way up today to feed for the season. The elk will be moving on rather quickly today and return later when the cattle have dispersed. But since the cattle aren't due for another hour or two, the men in charge thought our boys would rather enjoy seeing the elk. And what are elk? Raiden said, growing impatient. Winter put a hand on each of the lieutenant's shoulders. It took our ancestors a few moons before they realized that the animals they labeled as elk were actually the same animals Terryp talked about in that book we read, Your First Day Here. Elk are wapiti. John gasped in surprise, and Raiden tried to match it, but it came out more as a coughing fit. Winter slapped him on the back, which did not help. We'll head over there as soon as you two are done eating. Are all of them here? The two are already on their way over to the meadow. The third is coming up with the cattle, the guard told him vaguely. You know how he likes to ride up with the herds. Winter nodded. Well then, boys, would you like to meet some not-so-mythological creatures? Yes, please, John said. Raiden grinned, a genuine, heartfelt grin. Absolutely. On the west side of this ridge, you say? West was as good a place as any to start searching for Edge. I'd love to. While John wolfed down the rest of his sandwich, Raiden subtly slipped a chunk of cheese, jerky, and several slices of bread into his jacket pockets. He didn't plan to be back for dinner. Perrin rubbed his hands eagerly, eyeing the elk herd sedately feeding and chewing their cud in front of him. Frequently he glanced behind him, up the slope he and Shem had just come down. It wouldn't take Winter, the lieutenants, and their guards long to come down it. While it was steep grasses, interspersed with jagged rocks, there were plenty of safe footholds. He assumed the young officers would want to jog down here as soon as they saw the elk. He was sure John would. He told John on a few occasions during their secret talks that wapiti were real, and soon some would come through this area on their annual migration. The lieutenant could hardly wait. Perrin so wished he could have arranged for an elephant to wander through, just to astonish John. But when he'd come to Salem next week, Perrin would take him to the university and show him the life-size paintings on display. But before all of them could see the wapiti, the group had to climb the slope which rose from the glacial valley, which might take them about half an hour, depending on how eager and in shape they were. It had been about that long since Perrin estimated the scout had delivered to them his proposal of meeting on this side of the mountain, and he could hardly wait to see their reaction to the wapiti, then to see Raden's reaction to him. That would be the test, and the determiner. How would he take to meeting the dead colonel who wasn't so dead? Perrin already knew how it would play out. Raden would gasp, stagger in surprise, then his shock would eventually morph into a grin, and he would readily accept Perrin's embrace, because what could be more powerful evidence of the world's lies than him and Shem alive? Shem, however, standing next to Perrin with his arms folded, brooded and glared at the meadow. Perrin gently elbowed him. "Trust me, it will be good." "If you say trust me one more time," Shem quietly boiled, "I'm going to punch you." Perrin chuckled, then stopped when he realized Shem was not smiling. He scooted a few protective inches away from him. Would Guide Gleese be coming to meet them if he didn't think today was the day? "He's coming," Shem hissed under his breath, "because you insisted today be the day. He's coming only to see what you've been up to, not because he endorses—" "Look, there they are!" Perrin pointed to the top of the ridge several hundred yards away, where the shapes of several men appeared. "Over here, over here!" He pulled Shem into a cluster of trees. "I want them to see the wapiti first, be fully enthralled and amazed, then we make our presence known." Shem rubbed his forehead and sighed. It didn't take them long to jog down the slope. The moment they recognized the herd, they were in a hurry, with John leading the pack. They're amazing!" he exclaimed, but in a hushed tone so as not to alarm the bull elk and his harem of 20. They stopped at the edge of the meadow. Raden cocked his head. "Not quite as big as I imagined." "But they're real! Don't you get it?" John tried to hold back his squeal. "If these are real, everything else can be real." The elk, still 100 paces away, trotted gracefully through the wide meadow to the edge of the trees. There was a loud mooing from the far side of the meadow that was driving them away. A cloud of dust obscured the view, but the thundering sound of an enormous herd of cattle was unmistakable. "Oh, don't go," Afra murmured at the elk, as Winter and the 4 guards chuckled in understanding. "There'll be more, John," one assured him. "They'll return when the cattle have dispersed." "Nice rack on that bull, though," another guard commented. But Raden didn't notice. He was too busy surveying the area. It wasn't ideal, but it was going to have to do. He had an idea, and it was this. Run. Just run and run and run through the meadow to the other side of the trees, then hide somewhere until dark. Then he'd pick his way back to Edge, wherever it may be. He was glad he didn't have anyone to share the idea with, because they would surely have looked at him as if he claimed to be king of the elk. But this was the best opportunity, and desperate times called for stupid plans. Still, it was remarkable, he told himself, how often a seemingly stupid plan worked. Someone to the side of them cleared his throat. "Afra and Raden," said a strangely familiar voice from a cluster of trees. I'm glad you see that they are real, and that because wapiti are real, so can be a great many other things. Raiden's jaw dropped as he recognized the voice, deep and rumbling, and the hair on his arm stood up as, through the trees, came, "Oh, Slag, you're alive." He didn't realize he'd said those words out loud, or that he'd actually shouted them. They'd filled his entire head, so naturally they had to burst out of his mouth. Perrin Shin chuckled, a bit surprised at Raiden's response. Yes, always have been. Good to see you again, Lieutenant." "Colonel Shin!" John Offord cried and ran to embrace him. Oh, of course he would, a small part of Raiden's mind commented as he watched Shin and Offra hug. The rest of Raiden's brain was far too overwhelmed with the thoughts of, "Slag, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive, and so is Zenas. Zenas is alive too. Doesn't look too happy about it right now, but General Snide," his brain screamed, but this time he kept his mouth shut. "They're slagging alive! Now what?" But fortunately at that moment, the small coherent part of his brain took over, because Shin had finished hugging Afra, who was now embracing Zenas, and Shin was staring intently at Raiden. Raiden knew exactly what to do. He held out his hand to shake the former colonel's, mostly to make sure that he was flesh and blood and not some strange manifestation. Yes, Shin's grip was still bone-crushing, and he smiled expectantly. Raiden returned it, even though his stomach was twisting and his head was churning. Despite the open air, Raiden was sure he was suffocating, and panic grew so rapidly that all of his appendages began to quake and tremble. General Raiden. The title popped into his head as soon as he released Shin's hand. He'd be promoted immediately to General Raiden as soon as he handed over these two traitors. Shin started to speak, and Raiden forced himself to concentrate on him instead of the title of General, which bounced around in his head. "Raiden, I'm sincerely sorry I startled you, but I hope you'll forgive me eventually. I was hoping that meeting us again like this would help solidify in your mind the many ways Idamia has deceived you, and has withheld from you all kinds of marvelous ideas and potential. Except for the potential to become the youngest general in the world." Shin turned to gesture to the meadow. "Look at this place. No one in the world can even imagine this exists, but it does. The world is so vast and holds so many incredible wonders that you're only beginning to learn. Next week, you'll see what I'm talking about, because I plan to take you—" "Hey!" Shem shouted, cutting Perrin off. "Hey, where are you going?" Raiden was sprinting. He'd picked a spot, a gap between two trees just beyond the herd. The forest thickened again behind it, and he could easily weave through it and find a hiding spot. And he decided he could run through the herd just to confuse things a bit. It'd have to do. He'd made his decision at the moment Shin had said he'd be taking them somewhere next week. But General Raiden had different plans for next week. Perrin blinked in shock to see Raiden running straight for the herd. What does he think he's doing? "Dear Creator," Winter gasped. "He's escaping!" By the time Shem, Perrin, Winter, John, and the 4 guards started chasing Raiden, he was over 100 paces ahead of them, making quick time across the meadow. And the elk did not appreciate their human invaders. The bull, insulted, began to charge at Afra, but was distracted by a guard shouting to draw his attention. That's when Afra hit a muddy patch, choosing not to believe it was something worse, and slipped on the grasses. Another guard, trying to keep his eye on the disappearing Raiden, nearly collided with an angry cow as she stepped forward to defend her calf. Perrin and Shem were more successful, however, dodging and darting and finally breaking through the edge of the meadow to see nothing but trees. Shem twisted to Perrin. "I told you!" But Perrin stared hopelessly into the forest. as John, Winter, and the 4 guards caught up to him. "Which way?" one guard asked. Another shook his head. "It's useless with the amount of men we have." "But we have to stop him," John insisted. "We have to." "We all know what needs to happen, Lieutenant Offra," Winter told him. Frustration thickened his tone. "We've been working this forest for many years, and we know how many men we need to flush out someone in hiding. No sense in us blindly running in there without a plan." Perrin said nothing, but stared in bewilderment into the trees. "The ranchers!" another guard exclaimed. "There should be at least 30 men coming with the cattle. In just a few minutes they'll be here." "Most of them aren't trained," Shem said, "but it's the best option we have. Men on horseback can cover more terrain, but Raiden still has that much of a head start." "But how far can he get in these trees?" Winter asked. "He's clueless as to where to go. We'll flush him out like a pheasant in the back garden." "I hope you're right," a guard mumbled. Perrin remained motionless, gaping at the forest before him, disillusioned tears building in his eyes. "We plot an area to search based on how fast Raiden can move, and I've seen him run," Shem said grimly. "He likely spent all of his strength on this dash. He'll be progressing much slower now." Raiden slipped into a gully, accidentally. But as he found his footing at the bottom of it, he decided this place was as good as any for a well-deserved rest. He looked around, saw nothing but dense undergrowth, towering pines, and a few rocks, and slumped to the ground. He did it! They didn't even follow him into the trees. Just like everyone else in the world, they stopped at the forest line. And Perrin Shin and Shem Zenas were still alive. Slagging idiots! Oh, if General Snide could see this! "No," he'd said back in harvest season, "there's no way they could still be alive." Snide was as stupid as the rest of them. When Raiden returned with the notes stowed in his socks and the directions to finding Shin and Zenas, not only would the Thorns lose their positions, but so might even Snide. And who would be in position to replace the advising general? Or even the high general? Raiden tried to slow his panting and his planning in order to hear if anything was around. But all that was approaching was the sound of cattle mooing, and they were closing in. He leaned against a log to catch his breath and looked up at the sky above him. Today it was a cloudless blue, just as it always was. "Lost a man, did you?" The rancher in his 60s shook his head admonishingly, as if his grandson had just confessed to dropping his pie on the ground. "And now you need some help." Shem's arms were still folded as cattle swirled around him. On Shem's order, Perrin had moved to the forest to keep the arriving animals from stampeding. Perched on a large boulder, he crouched anxiously, like a guilty mountain lion. Shem nodded to the mounted rancher. "We have a rat of a man who escaped the world and now has escaped us. I need everyone you can spare to conduct a search in the forest west of here." The man smiled easily. "I'm sure we can assist our assistant Zenas. We have about 20 men, with 10 more bringing in the strays. Guide Gleese is back there with his son. Should we find your lost rat before he arrives?" "That would be ideal, yes," Shem sighed. The rancher nudged his horse away from Shem, then put his fingers into his mouth and whistled a complicated pattern. Back along the tree line, Perrin leaned over to Winter standing with him. What was that all about? "The ranchers have a system of whistles to communicate with each other. You can't even bring your cattle up here unless you know how to whistle," he said. Perrin watched in fascination as a few more men rode up as quickly as the growing herd would allow. In the distance he heard the whistle repeated, likely calling in riders from the edges of the broad meadow. Within a few minutes, Shem was surrounded by men of all age on horseback. Perrin watched Shem gesturing to the forest beyond, pointing out landmarks and indicating who should go where. Moments later, the men began to head into the trees beyond Perrin. Feeling it was safe now, Perrin hopped off the boulder to pace along the tree line. "I'm going after Raiden," he told Winter. "No, sir," he said patiently, sitting down on a log. "We're here to wait, remember? We escort Raiden back to the fort. I stay here in case he's injured. You stay here in case he's belligerent." "Shem's doing this to punish me, you know," Perrin decided, continuing his pacing. "He knows how badly I need to reach Raiden, and he doesn't want... Wait a minute, where are the cows going?" "Cattle," Winter corrected him. "Cows are females, and there are several bulls as well as many calves among them. And they're going wherever they wish. Except, interestingly, not over here." Perrin stared in amazement as the cattle broke up into their own groups, some heading east up the ridge toward the glacial valley, some turning to the trees in the west, a few seeming to go back north, but a large group headed south, making a wide berth around him. "But you'll lose them," Perrin pointed out. "For the season, yes," Winter said. "They graze and get fat, and just before the harvest festival we come back and retrieve them. The cattle know when snowing season is coming, and they're happy to follow us back to Salem." Perrin watched the parade of beef. "Guidely said something once about using me to chase the stragglers back to Salem. Yeah, there's always a few young bulls who think they'd prefer to stay out here all snowing season. Those are the ones who know little about wolves and their appetites. We just need to nudge those rebellious boys back home." Perrin sighed in exasperation as he stood there, useless. "This is ridiculous," he declared a minute later. "Now the cattle are invading the forest. All Raiden has to do is hunker down for the day, then sneak away between two bulls at night." "Not between two bulls, surely." "You know what I mean, Winter," General Shin snapped. He immediately held up his hands in apology. Winter nodded his acceptance. "I just can't sit here." But he did, as he watched another wave of roast on the hoof complain their way into the trees, and to where the ranchers were searching for Raiden. Within minutes, the meadow in front of him was nearly emptied of animals. "I think it's safe for you to step out of the trees," Winter informed him. "I also don't see any reason why you can't head up the mountain in search of Raiden. The cattle are ahead of you now. Perhaps you might find something?" He winked at Perrin. Perrin nodded gratefully and started in an awkward, slippery jog up the hill. Cattle had no sense of hygiene. Raiden was pinned, curled up in a ball, in the cavity under a boulder, with a large wet nose sniffing him. Raiden kicked at it. The calf jumped back and bleated angrily, which brought his mother to investigate, which meant an even larger, wetter nose snuffing and spraying at Raiden, who tried to shield his face. "Just get out of here!" Raiden bellowed. "Disgusting!" He didn't worry about anyone hearing him because the mooing was deafening. He'd made it to the top of the ridge on the west side of the meadow and paused to see what was happening down below. That's when he saw the first cattle come up and the men on horses. It was a mad scramble after that to find a hiding place while hundreds of smelling creatures searched for the ideal places to drop their offerings. There were several steaming samples in front of Raiden already. Soon the stench would drive him from his hiding place if his need to vomit didn't force him out earlier. "This is insane," he declared as he peered between cow legs to see what might be happening beyond the top of the ridge. All he saw were more cow parts and bull parts. It turned his belly. "I'm running out of time," he mumbled. "These things could be here for hours, days. Who deliberately loses their cattle in the forests?" A horse and a rider trampled suddenly in front of the boulder, paused, then moved along. Raiden swallowed down a terrified lump in his throat. "They couldn't have heard me," he whispered, then slapped his hand in front of his mouth, just in case. He had to get out of there. Shem stood high on a ridge and scanned the terrain. Trees, shrubs, rocks, logs, and cattle as far as the eye could see. He sighed in frustration and closed his eyes to clear his mind. Somewhere Raiden was hiding. Where? Struck with an idea, Shem opened his eyes and looked down the slope behind him again. There was a distinct openness in the terrain a few hundred paces below him, where no cattle wandered. That's because Perrin was. Shem grumbled as Perrin glanced up and caught his eye. He waved guiltily and continued to pick his way around the evidence that several hundred cattle had working digestive systems. "That's why you're wearing boots," Shem called down to him. "As I told you before, tuck in your trouser legs. Why are you here?" "Winter thought it was safe now," he said, making his way up to Shem. "For the cattle, that is." Perrin joined him to look around. His sigh said it all. "No, it's not hopeless," Shem read his mind, "although it's seemingly quite impossible at the moment. Chaos is exactly what he needs to give us the slip, and nothing says chaos more than 1,000 head of cattle." "It may be early for this," Perrin began hesitantly, "but yes, you told me so." "Save the apologies for later." Shem stared out at the terrain. He slowly pivoted, looking for any sign that someone had found Raiden. Perrin peered deep into the shadows as well. "I am sorry." "Save it." "I realize now—" "Save it!" Perrin clamped his lips shut. "There," Shem whispered, and pointed down the slope they had come up. "Do you see it?" Perrin squinted. "I'm trying to." "By that boulder!" Shem gestured again, as if that would make what he saw clearer. "Near the ground." Perrin squinted harder. "I think—" "And don't just pretend to see it," Shem snipped. "Tell me if you actually do." Perrin nodded obediently, but his eyes bounced from one large boulder to another. Shem exhaled in exasperation. "Losing patience with me, aren't you, Shem? I understand." "Save it!" Perrin opened his mouth, but then shut it again, because he did see something, moving parallel to their position, beyond them on the slope. It was a crouching figure, but too far away for positive identification. He seemed to be using a black cow as cover. Since he was wearing brown clothing, the animal wasn't the best choice. "Stay close to the trees," Shem whispered to Perrin above the mooing behind them. "I'll jog ahead to catch him from the front, while you stay back to cover his retreat." Perrin nodded and began to creep quickly down the slope, while Shem trotted in a line perpendicular to him. Follow the cattle. It was his only chance. They stank. They moved awkwardly. They stank. Raiden could not get the stench out of his mind. He'd likely never eat beef again. But they were just the right size to conceal him. Follow the cattle. Perrin had lost sight of the figure that must have been Raiden, but still he trotted in the same direction. With any luck, Shem or a rancher would have already apprehended him. Perrin didn't want to be the first, because his first words would have been, "Why?" Why couldn't Raiden just try? Just listen to what Perrin had to offer. What was so alluring about the world that Raiden was willing to give up all of this for something so much less? To Perrin, rejecting this life was throwing away a beautiful cake to snatch a shriveled bean. And beans were revolting. But Perrin had to understand this. How could he defend Salem against the world if he couldn't comprehend what made the world so obtuse? He continued along the side of the slope, realizing that he was the guarder now, looking for the soldier. And then he spotted him. The man, who Perrin was now sure was Raiden, had swapped cows and was traipsing along with the brown one, doing a half-squatting, half-loping movement to keep up with the animal that didn't appreciate his newfound affection for her or for her camouflage. Raiden was about 300 paces away from Perrin, with all kinds of terrain between them. Perrin searched for a scout or a rancher who might be nearer, but he found no one. Everyone had headed over the ridge and were going down the other side. No one had suspected Raiden would double back. Rather clever, Perrin had to admit. But worse than that, Raiden was headed in the direction of Mount Deceit. If he continued northwest, then up and over that ridge, he'd find himself in the canyon next to it, and at the end of that canyon was the dead village of Moreland. Should Raiden recognize deceit, he could make it to Moreland in just a couple of hours and be back to Edge by nightfall. Thorn would have his report by bedtime. Frantically, Perrin looked around for a strategy, and then it came to him. A bull was coming back over the ridge, apparently deciding it was far too crowded on the other side. Behind him was a mass of his friends, cows, calves, and some younger bulls, and they all spied the meadow below them looking like paradise. Perrin sighed. It was cruel, but he had no other choice. They poured over the ridge, maybe 100 strong, and just for him. Perrin spotted Raiden, glanced again at the approaching herd, and made a few quick calculations. John stood at the bottom of the slope of the meadow, but all he saw was livestock. Raiden was headed back to Edge, and everything would fail. That thought made him sick. He massaged his hands and paced, looking up, looking around, looking down to see what he'd slipped in, then looking up again. Nothing, absolutely nothing. No, something. Nearly at the top of the ridge, he saw a figure, but its stance was different than Raiden's. The man raised his hands high above his head, then he started to run at a mass of animals on its way back down. When John heard the distinct yelling, he knew there was only one man's voice that could carry that far, General Shin, and he was chasing the cattle. Shem knew the sound, and it sent shivers down his back. The ground trembled, and he spun to see the source. The stampede of 100 head of cattle barreled down the slope to the meadow. Shem was grateful he was to the side of it. Maybe there were wolves up there, he mused, as he climbed on top of a stack of rocks for a better view of the panicked animals. Or maybe it was just Perrin? But why? He was running, shouting, waving his arms like... Shem spun to scan the terrain below him. There, sprinting faster than he had ever had in his entire life, was Raiden, leading the stampede to the meadow. They'd come out of nowhere. He was jogging next to one solitary brown beast. Then suddenly they came like an avalanche of mooing boulders, and all Raiden could do was run. John scrambled to the top of a boulder for a better view and to avoid being trampled, and noticed Raiden sprinting into the meadow in the lead of a very noisy, very swift parade. But he wasn't fast enough. How the cattle could lumber so swiftly was astonishing. They caught up with Raiden, then surrounded him. Then Raiden stumbled. Shem gripped his head when he saw Raiden go down. There was no way, no possible way any of this was going to end well. He'd seen stampedes before. Nothing survives. Perrin had put his arms down a while ago, feeling badly for causing so many creatures to think the end of their lives was running straight for them. He slip-slided and jogged down the slope on his way to the meadow. He was sure he'd seen Raiden flushed out of hiding. Now it was a matter of finding him in the swirling panic of stake. John strained to see the lieutenant in the swarm, but there were simply too many animals. They continued to run to the east through the meadow and up the other side. If they continued over that hill, they would descend on the glacial fort in just minutes. But the race up the hillside would tire them out, John hoped. The fort would be safe. The meadow, on the other hand, was a trampled mess. As the herd thinned, John saw Raiden lying on the ground, motionless. Perrin broke through the tree line. Everything before him was moving, except for one brown lump in the middle of the meadow. A calf stumbled over it, causing Perrin to flinch. No, 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 he whispered as he rushed to the body, his presence having the effect of scattering the last of the animals. He dropped to his knees next to the former lieutenant. Oh, Raiden, I'm so sorry. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He heard someone approaching and turned to see John stop a few feet away. Perrin turned back to Raiden and winced. His legs were obviously broken, twisted at odd angles. That was probably why John was now retching into the grasses behind him. Raden's arm was flopped over his face, and Perrin leaned forward to gently move it aside to see the young officer's face, and found himself staring at an army-issued long blade digging into his neck. Perrin gulped. The ferocity of Raden's expression startled him. His teeth were clenched, and his other hand gripped Perrin's shirt so tightly around his throat that he could barely breathe. "Why'd you still have to be alive, Shin?" Astonished, Perrin didn't know how to respond. "Why couldn't you just let me go?" Raden rasped. "You've ruined everything. Everything. Why couldn't you just let me live my life?" "You're alive!" John exclaimed, rushing over to him. "I don't know," Raden snarled, forcing the point of the blade into Perrin's neck, nearly piercing his flesh. "I can't feel anything from my chest down." Perrin had to fix this right now. "Give me the—" He was trying to say, "knife, son," but Raden had other ideas. With the last of his strength, he hauled himself up on Perrin with one hand and attempted to plunge the knife into his neck with the other. Perrin's brain never had a chance to give its suggestion as to what to do next because his training took over. General Shin wrenched the knife out of Raden's hand and plunged it into his heart. That's when his mind finally caught up, and he stared in horror at the lieutenant who went limp. "Dear Creator," was all Perrin could whimper. John finished emptying his stomach in the grasses. "What did you do?" was the next thing Perrin heard. Shem, who'd come running across the meadow, arrived to see the long knife protruding from the dead soldier. Perrin sat clumsily. I just... "He had no choice," John declared loyally as he wiped his chin. "Raden tried to kill him." Perrin only dimly heard the argument which ensued between them. He stared at the knife, wondering where it had come from, and wondering how it got into Raden's chest. Perrin didn't do that. No, he'd never kill a soldier, an officer, one of his. He'd killed many men before, but none who he had chatted with and eaten with. "Not like he was going to jump up and chase him," Shem was shouting, but in Perrin's head he sounded hazy. "You didn't see what happened. He nearly slashed Shin's throat. He had to defend himself," John shouted distantly back. Perrin only stared, until a distant movement in the eastern hillside caught his eye. Someone had come over from the fort on a horse, and he was sliding off of it. Although he was far away, Perrin immediately recognized the man's stance, or more accurately, his presence, which seemed to fill the entire meadow. It was Guide Glees. Perrin wasn't sure where the words came from, but they streamed from the guide straight into Perrin's mind. It couldn't have been more dreadful if it were the Creator himself saying, "Oh, Perrin, what have you done?" That's the end of the chapter. Thank you.